I worked in hospital supply chain management for 22 years. That's not a career you fall into by accident. You build it. You learn which vendors cut corners on sterile packaging and which ones actually answer the phone at 2 in the morning when an OR is short on suction canisters. You learn that the difference between a smooth surgical day and a canceled procedure is sometimes just one person who knew to check the backup order 3 days in advance. My name is not important. What happened to me is, for the last 9 of those 22 years, I was director of supply chain operations at a mid-sized regional hospital in the Carolinas. About 400 beds, 2 surgical suites, a level 3 trauma designation. We weren't a major academic medical center, but we were the only hospital within 40 miles for a lot of people. And I took that seriously in a way that I cannot fully explain to someone who has never had that kind of responsibility land on them every single morning before they finish their first cup of coffee. I had a team of 11. I knew every one of their names, their kids' names, which ones were taking night classes, which ones were dealing with aging parents. I ran a tight operation. Joint Commission came through and called our inventory management a model for facilities our size. That was 2021. I still have the letter somewhere. The CEO at the time was a man I'll call my boss. We had a respectful relationship. Not warm exactly, but the kind of professional trust that you earn over years of not causing problems and solving the ones that come up without being asked. He knew what I did. He knew why it mattered. That was enough. Then his son started showing up. He would have been 26, maybe 27. He'd done an MBA somewhere I'd never heard of, spent about 14 months at a consulting firm in Charlotte, and apparently decided that qualified him to reshape how a hospital managed its critical supply chain. His father brought him on as a senior operations advisor, which was a title that had never existed at our facility before and which appeared in the org chart directly above my own position without anyone consulting me about it. The first time he walked into my department, he was carrying a tablet and wearing a sport coat that cost more than most of my team made in a week. He shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. He told me he'd been reviewing our procurement processes and had some observations. I said I was happy to hear them. I was not happy to hear them, but I said I was. Because I have been doing this long enough to know that you do not win that particular battle in the first 5 minutes. His observations were that we were slow, we were redundant, we were, in his word, legacy-oriented. He had a slide deck, an actual slide deck, that he'd apparently prepared for this informal hallway conversation. He pulled it up on his tablet and walked me through it like I was a new hire who had never seen a purchase order in my life. I asked him if he'd had a chance to review our Joint Commission documentation. He said that was a great question and that compliance was always important, but that in his experience, organizations often used compliance requirements as an excuse to avoid innovation. He said that with a straight face. In a hospital, about supply chain compliance. I smiled and said I'd take his feedback under consideration. Over the next 6 weeks, he started attending every department meeting. Then he started scheduling his own. He would pull individual team members aside for what he called efficiency conversations. And I would find out afterward that he'd been asking them questions about my processes, my decisions, my reasoning for certain protocols. He was building a case. I could see it being assembled in real time, the way you can sometimes see a storm coming from 40 miles out when the light changes just slightly at the horizon. The specific protocol he targeted was our 3-stage vendor verification process. Every new vendor that supplied anything that touched patient care, gloves, tubing, wound care products, IV supplies, went through a background check, an insurance verification, and a compliance review before we placed a single order. It added about 8 to 12 business days to onboarding a new vendor. He said we were the only hospital in our peer group that did all 3 stages internally. He said we could cut the timeline to 3 days if we outsourced the insurance check and eliminated the compliance pre-screening, doing it post-contract instead. I explained to him very carefully what had happened the last time we'd done something similar at a previous facility where I'd consulted. I explained that we had, over the past 4 years, flagged 3 vendors during the compliance pre-screen who had outstanding OSHA violations, one of whom was actively under investigation by the state for fraud. I explained that post-contract compliance review is not a safety net. It's a paper trail for after something goes wrong. He nodded throughout. He said he understood my concerns. Then he went to his father. 2 weeks later, I was informed in a meeting, attended by my boss, his son, and our VP of operations, that the new vendor onboarding process would be implemented effective the 1st of the following month. 3 days. Insurance outsourced. Compliance review moved to post-contract. My input was described in the meeting notes as reviewed and considered. I documented everything. Every email, every meeting note, every change to the protocol. I put it all in a folder, saved it to my personal drive at home, and I kept doing my job. Then came the morning he asked me to apologize. We were in a department-wide operations meeting. 12 people in the room, including 2 of my senior coordinators, the VP of operations, and 2 staff from the nursing supervisor's office. He was presenting the new vendor onboarding metrics, the 30-day results since the change had been implemented. He was proud of them. Processing time down 62%. Vendor satisfaction scores up. He had another slide deck. Somewhere around slide 4, I asked a question. I asked whether the new metrics accounted for the 2 vendors we had onboarded in the past month who had not yet completed the post-contract compliance review. He said they had not, because the review was still in process. I said that one of those vendors had supplied us with a shipment of surgical gloves and that I had received informal communication from our quality team that the gloves were failing integrity testing at a higher than acceptable rate. I said I thought that was relevant information to include in a 30-day review. The room got quiet. He looked at me. Then, he said, in front of all 12 people, that I was sabotaging his initiative. He said I had been resistant from the beginning and that I was now deliberately undermining his work in front of staff to make him look bad. He said he was going to need to discuss my attitude with his father. He said all of this with the confidence of a person who had never been wrong about anything because he had never been held accountable for anything. I did not respond. I wrote the information about the gloves in my notebook and I waited for the meeting to end. The next morning, I was called into my boss's office. He looked tired. He told me that his son had come to him the evening before and that there were concerns about my cooperation. He told me that the transition had been difficult and that he understood change was hard for people who had been doing things a certain way for a long time. He said he valued my experience, but that moving forward, he needed me to be a team player. Then he said it. He said that he needed me to apologize to his son, publicly, at the next department meeting, for the way I had spoken to him in front of the team. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I want to make sure I understand. You're asking me to apologize for raising a patient safety concern in a meeting about patient safety." He said it wasn't about the concern, it was about the way I'd raised it. I said I would think about it. I drove home that night and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. My wife came in around 9 and she looked at my face and she didn't ask what happened. She just put a cup of coffee in front of me and sat down across the table. After a while she said, "What do you need to do?" I said I needed to resign. She nodded. She said, "Okay, then let's figure out what that looks like." We talked until midnight. I am not a man who makes impulsive decisions. I have a mortgage. We have 2 kids, one finishing college and one who started 3 years ago. I had a pension vesting in 14 months. I knew all of that. I did the math out loud at the kitchen table, while my wife listened and asked questions and helped me think through it clearly. By the time we went to bed, we had a plan. The next morning I sent my resignation letter to HR. I copied my boss. I gave 2 weeks' notice. In the letter, I cited a fundamental misalignment in organizational values and priorities as they relate to patient safety standards. I did not mention his son by name. I did not need to. I also placed 3 phone calls that day. One to a former colleague who had left our facility 2 years earlier and was now director of operations at a larger health system 2 states away. One to an attorney I'd worked with on a contract dispute years before. And one to our state's Department of Health. That last call was not made out of anger. I want to be clear about that. It was made because I had documented over 6 weeks a series of changes to vendor compliance protocols at a licensed healthcare facility that I genuinely believed created patient safety risks. I had an obligation to report that. I would have had that obligation whether or not I had been asked to apologize to anyone's son. I walked people through what I knew. I answered questions. I provided the documentation I had saved. My last day was a Friday. I cleaned up my desk quietly, said goodbye to my team, and went home. Monday morning I woke up at the same time I always do. Made coffee. Went for a walk. Came back and started working on my resume. The call started Thursday. The first was from my former colleague, asking if I was seriously available and if I'd be interested in a consulting engagement while they searched for a permanent candidate. I said yes. We agreed on a rate. A good one. The kind of rate that made my 2 weeks' notice feel like the best financial decision I'd made in years. The second call was from the attorney. He had looked at the documentation I'd shared. He said I should hold on to everything. The third call came from a number I didn't recognize. It was the VP of operations at my old facility. She did not introduce herself warmly. She said there were some operational issues that had come up and she was trying to understand certain processes and vendor relationships. I told her I was no longer employed there and that she should direct any questions to my successor, and I wished her a good afternoon. What I learned about what happened next came from 2 people who were still there and who reached out to me over the following weeks. I'm not going to describe what they told me in detail because I believe in letting people speak for themselves. But the broad strokes were these. The surgical glove vendor was placed on hold after integrity testing results were formally reported to the materials management team. A second vendor, also recently onboarded under the new 3-day process, was found to have an unresolved state health department citation from 18 months earlier. The kind of thing our old compliance pre-screen would have caught before a single purchase order was signed. The state health department, from what I understood, had made inquiries. The facility had to respond to those inquiries. Responding to inquiries of that kind is not a small thing. It requires documentation. It requires explanations. It requires someone to account for decisions that were made and why they were made. His son was still there from what I could tell. Whether he remained in his advisor role or whether the title quietly disappeared, I honestly don't know and I stopped following it. What I do know is that 6 weeks after I left, I was retained by my colleague's health system as a senior supply chain consultant. The engagement was supposed to be 90 days. It became 18 months. At the end of that period, they offered me a permanent position. I took it, and a higher title and a salary that made my old salary look like a rough draft. I also know that I never apologized. Not because I am a proud person. I have plenty of reasons to be humble. 22 years of things that went wrong. Vendors that slipped through, mistakes I made and had to correct. I know what it costs to be wrong in this field. I know what it means when a supply failure reaches a patient. I didn't apologize, because there was nothing to apologize for. I raised a concern that turned out to be valid. I documented a process change that turned out to have consequences. I left when I was asked to perform an act of theater in place of an act of accountability. Some of my former colleagues have asked me if I feel vindicated. That's not really the right word. Vindication implies the outcome was the point. It wasn't. The point was the 22 years before the outcome. The point was the 3 vendors we caught before they ever got close to a patient. The point was all the mornings I came in early and stayed late, not because anyone was watching, but because the work required it. His son walked in with a tablet and a slide deck and tried to replace all of that with a 62% improvement in onboarding speed. And for a little while, it worked. On paper. In a slide deck. In a department-wide meeting where no one asked the question I asked it. I'm glad I did. There's something my father used to say when I was growing up, and he was still running his auto parts store in Central Ohio. He said, the fastest way to do something is usually the right way until it isn't. I didn't fully understand that until I was about 35 and watched a distributor relationship I'd rushed go sideways and cost my previous employer about $40,000 in returns and resourcing fees. After that, I understood it. I never forgot it. Experience is not stubbornness. Experience is pattern recognition built on things you personally watched go wrong. When an experienced person raises a concern, the correct response is not to tell them they're resistant to change. The correct response is to ask them what they saw before and to listen when they answer. Nobody asked me that, so I stopped answering. My wife says, the best part of the whole thing is that I sleep better now. She's right. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from spending your days defending things that should not have to be defended, and the specific kind of relief when you stop. I didn't fully feel it until about 3 weeks after I left, when I realized I had made it to Wednesday afternoon without once checking my email with my stomach clenched. I still think about my team. I hope they're okay. I hope whoever came in after me had the sense to listen to them because they knew what they were doing and they deserved someone who understood that. If you're in a position right now where someone is asking you to be quiet about something you know is wrong, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I have a mortgage. You have your own version of a mortgage. These decisions are not simple, and anyone who tells you they are is selling something. What I will tell you is that the day I sent that resignation letter, I did not feel relief. I felt scared. I felt like I had just stepped off a ledge and I didn't know how far down the ground was. That feeling lasted about a week. Then the calls started, and I remembered something I had known for 22 years and had somehow managed to forget in those last 6 weeks, that people who actually know how to do something are not as easy to replace as a slide deck makes them look. They called. I answered. On my terms. That's the whole story. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in those 6 weeks. Not the drama of it, the resignation letter, the empty desk, the phone calls, but the quieter mechanics underneath all of it, the way things tend to unfold when people in positions of authority stop paying attention to what's real and start paying attention to what's convenient. The owner's son didn't walk into that hospital with bad intentions. I genuinely believe that. He walked in with a slide deck and a theory and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having watched something go wrong on your watch. That's not evil. That's an experience, dressed up in a sport coat. The problem wasn't who he was. The problem was what happened when no one around him was willing to say, out loud, that the emperor had no clothes, except me. And when I said it, they asked me to apologize for it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not that I was dismissed. That happens to experienced people all the time, and it's not personal. It's just how organizations sometimes work when they stop valuing the right things. What I keep coming back to is the ask itself. Apologize, publicly, for raising a patient safety concern at a healthcare facility. There is a version of me, maybe 10 years younger, who would have done it. Who would have calculated the pension months and the mortgage payments and the kids' tuition and decided that swallowing it was the practical thing to do. I understand that man. I was that man for a long time, but there is something that happens when you spend 2 decades doing work that actually matters. Work where the downstream consequences of a bad decision aren't just a missed quarterly target, but a patient who receives a compromised product, and it changes your relationship with your own silence. You stop being able to afford it in the same way. Not because you become reckless, because you understand, in a very specific and unabstract way, what silence costs. What I did after I resigned wasn't revenge. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the story to be about winning, and it isn't. Filing a report with the state health department wasn't a power move. It was an obligation I had accumulated over 22 years of understanding what those compliance protocols actually protected. The fact that it had consequences for the facility, that was cause and effect, not poetic justice. They made decisions. Those decisions had outcomes. That's just how things work when you remove the people who understood why the guardrails existed. The harder lesson, the one I actually carry with me, is about what it means to know something and to say it anyway, even when saying it costs you something real. Integrity is not a comfortable quality. It doesn't negotiate well with self-preservation. It has a way of putting you in rooms where everyone else has already agreed to look the other way, and asking you to be the one who doesn't. Those rooms are lonely. The morning after I sent my resignation letter, I sat in my kitchen and I was not proud and triumphant. I was scared. I was 53 years old and I had just voluntarily walked away from the best job I'd ever had because I refused to apologize for telling the truth. The calls came later. The consulting rate came later. The better title came later. But none of that was guaranteed when I made the decision. I made the decision in the dark, without knowing how it ended. And I think that's the only way integrity actually works. Not as a strategy you deploy when you can see the outcome, but as a practice you maintain when you can't. My father ran an auto parts store for 30 years and he never made it onto anyone's org chart. But he taught me that the way you do a thing is the thing. You either keep the standard or you don't. And when someone asks you to abandon it publicly, in front of people who are watching to see what you'll do, that's not a personnel issue, that's a test of character. I hope I passed it. I think I did.